There's a town in Pennsylvania where the ground is literally on fire, not in a poetic sense or some play on words. The ground itself has been burning for over 60 years. And the strangest part is that nobody has managed to stop it. Centralia once looked like any other mining town. Families lined the porches in summer, kids ran down the streets chasing each other, and church bells rang on Sundays. But everything changed in 1962 when a fire slipped underground and found its way into the endless veins of coal beneath the town. From there, Centralia began to sink. Literally. The air was filled with toxic smoke. Entire houses collapsed without warning. Some people whispered about curses, while some swore it was all part of a government plot. But the truth is far more complicated than a single rumour. And if you're thinking the fire might die out soon, experts estimate it could keep burning for another 200 years. How did this happen? And more importantly, why hasn't anyone stopped it? On May 27th, 1962, Centralia's town council held its usual Memorial Day cleanup. The site was an old landfill right next to the cemetery, dug into an old strip mine. It was routine. The volunteer fire crew lit the trash, let it burn, then hosed it down. They figured that was the end of it. But 2 days later, smoke came back. The crew returned, put it out and went home. A week later, it showed up again. That's when it became clear that something was wrong. The fire hadn't gone out at all. A bulldozer was eventually brought in to dig deeper, and that's when the real discovery happened. You see, beneath all the piled up trash was a 15-foot wide opening. It was hidden in the pit wall, and it led straight into the abandoned network of coal mines under the town. That hidden passage was like a direct invitation for fire to spread, where it never should have gone. From that point on, the story of Centralia took a turn that nobody in 1962 could have imagined. Sometimes people talked about faint wisps of smoke here and there, or a smell they couldn't quite place. By midsummer though, smoke was rising more often from cracks in the ground. On July 2nd, people started complaining to the council about the stench around the dump site. Monsignor William Burke of St. Ignatius Church even complained about the smoke drifting toward the church grounds. By then, plants in the area had already died off, grasses had vanished, and what should have been green patches of earth looked burnt out and lifeless. Sometimes the smoke came thin and light, like a small campfire. Other times it rolled out thick and heavy, black mixed with grey, carrying the harsh smell of burning coal. Gas detectors soon confirmed carbon monoxide in the air around the dump, with levels consistent with an underground coal fire. On August 9th, 1962, the readings were so high in the surrounding mines that they had to shut down operations. Overnight, men who relied on those mines for work were left idle. For people living there, the weirdness got personal. It wasn't just about mines shutting down or warning signs from the government. It was waking up to smoke curling out of the backyard, or walking to school past sidewalks that were splitting open, warm to the touch like a stove left on low. It was seeping into basements, filling homes with fumes. Families had to leave their homes because the air inside had become unsafe to breathe. The fire didn't just stay hidden underground. Pretty soon, it started showing itself in everyday life. By 1963, steam was puffing up through cracks in the ground. One moment, the street looked normal. The next, it was hazy with smoke. And the heat was unreal. Some spots got so hot they could melt rubber. 900 degrees, sometimes over 1300. People joked about frying an egg on the sidewalk, but honestly, it wasn't funny. If you stood in the wrong place too long, the soles of your shoes could literally start to melt. Winters in Centralia got weird. Snow covered the hills, but cracks in the highway steamed, and the pavement stayed warm. You could walk barefoot on spots of road, while everything else was frozen. The fire kept breaking through in dangerous ways. In 1979, a gas station owner found his underground fuel tank sitting at 170 degrees. 2 years later, a family's pet canary died from fumes, and a mine inspector admitted he wouldn't spend a night in town because the carbon monoxide was so bad. Everyday life twisted around the fire. Basements filled with gas, smoke rose from sinkholes, and the air left people dizzy. Kids even grew up knowing which cracks to avoid and which patches of ground burned hot under their shoes. Clarence Kashner, who led the Union for Independent Miners and Truckers, raised the alarm that more than 200 men were out of work and dozens of small mines had already been forced to shut down. A retired miner even offered to help map out where the pillars and tunnels were, saying he had walked under the town himself. He believed he and others like him could point out ways to fight the fire. But his words were never taken seriously, and the fire kept on moving. And it did not move in a straight line. With old cave-ins and sloppy mining all over the place, the flames just found random gaps and spread wherever they could. By late 1962, it had already pushed to the edges of town. By May the next year, it had moved about 700 feet eastward. It wasn't one tidy fire either. Think of it more like a patchwork of burn zones, spreading underground in different directions. Over the years, those patches linked up into a giant network, stretching across hundreds of acres. By 2012, it had already swallowed about 400 acres, and it's still creeping forward. 50, sometimes 70 feet, every single year. It wasn't just Centralia that paid the price. The fire spread south and eventually swallowed up the nearby village of Burnsville. This place had been around since the mid-1800s, named after the Byrne family who first settled there. It was never as big as Centralia, but it had its own life going for a while. 3 grocery stores, a school that ran until the 1930s, and even a few bars that kept the small-town energy alive. But in the early 1980s, engineers studying the fire came to a grim conclusion. The data from boreholes showed the combustion zones would almost certainly move under Burnsville. Centralia's northern edge might have had a chance, but Burnsville was right in the line of fire. By the winter of 1987, most families had already been forced to leave. A few stubborn holdouts lasted a while longer, but the writing was on the wall. The last house in Burnsville was abandoned and bulldozed in 1996. Today, nothing is left of it. An entire community of 75 people was erased because an underground fire refused to stop moving. By the time Burnsville was gone, it wasn't just the houses falling apart. The ground itself was breaking up, and even the main highway through town started to split. Pennsylvania Route 61, the main highway through Centralia, turned into one of the clearest signs of the fire underground. At first, crews patched it up, but the heat kept wrecking it. The pavement cracked open, sometimes more than a foot wide, and gas poured out. People remembered the road rising in odd bumps, almost like the ground itself was breathing. By the early 1990s, after repeated accidents and even a collision involving a state vehicle, officials finally closed the highway for good. Now, all that's left of that highway is a broken stretch of asphalt, covered in graffiti leading nowhere. The smoke and cracked asphalt made Centralia look bizarre, but in February 1981, the ground itself turned into a trap, and the danger stopped being just talk. It is one thing to hear about smoke leaking from the ground or roads warping under the heat, but the real danger of the Centralia fire came into focus on a cold February afternoon. In 1981, 12-year-old Todd Domboski was playing in his grandmother's backyard when the earth suddenly opened up beneath him. The ground just gave way, swallowing him into a hole of wet, hot soil. Todd would later say he heard a roar beneath him, like a hurricane trapped underground. That noise was the fire. Rotten egg vapours blasted into his face as he slipped deeper, and for a moment it looked like he would be pulled straight into the flames below. The hole was massive. Some described it as 4 feet wide and up to 150 feet deep. Others said it was more like 80 or 100 feet down. Either way, no kid was getting out of there on his own. The only thing that saved him was luck. An exposed tree root stuck out just far enough for him to cling to. His cousin, 14-year-old Eric Wolfgang, heard his screams, sprinted over, and dragged him out. Todd survived with barely a scratch, which feels like a miracle considering what was waiting at the bottom. That sinkhole got national attention, partly because it happened at the worst possible moment. On the very day Todd almost died, a US representative and the governor of Pennsylvania, Richard Louis Thornburg, were both in town to check out the situation. The story hit headlines across the country, and suddenly the quiet town nobody had cared about was front-page news. I can only imagine how terrifying it must have been for locals who already suspected the fire was dangerous. Now they had proof in the most shocking way possible. Todd lived with nightmares after that day, the kind of trauma you do not just shake off. He later struggled with post-traumatic stress and sadly died in 2022 from an overdose. For Centralia, though, his near-death experience became the tipping point. Residents started banding together, creating groups like the Concerned Citizens Action Group against the Centralia mine fire. demanding that something be done. Of course, the fire had already been raging for decades, and newspapers had been tracking it from the start. Back in 1962, the Shamokin News Dispatch started running stories about it. Miners were warning that smoke and heat were filling their tunnels, and hundreds of them had already lost their jobs as the fumes made the mines impossible to work in. Local reporter David D. Koch took it further, covering the story year after year until he published a book called Fire Underground. He is one of the main reasons the disaster was documented in such detail. By the late 70s and early 80s, papers had turned openly critical, calling out government agencies for dragging their feet. One editorial, in 1979, blasted officials for what it called a do-nothing attitude, which, if you ask me, probably summed up how most residents felt by then. In 1983, Congress finally put money on the table. $42 million was allocated to relocate about 1,200 residents. Most people took the buyouts, grateful for the chance to start fresh. Between 1985 and 1991, more than 500 homes were torn down. But not everyone was ready to give up. By 1990, the population had dropped from over 1,000 to barely 60 people. The ones who stayed had their reasons. Some were too old to move, others too stubborn to let go, and a few simply loved the place no matter what. Mayor Lamar Mervyn, who was 83 at the time, famously said he had no reason to relocate and that he liked it right where he was. His wife Lana was even more defiant. When the state offered her a buyout, she said flatly, "They're not getting it." Then there was John Komarniski, one of the younger holdouts. He actually moved into Centralia after the fire had started, saying he liked the empty, overgrown look of the place. He described it like a new kind of America, part wild, part abandoned. By 1992, the state had lost its patience. Governor Bob Casey eventually stepped in and used eminent domain, taking over every property in Centralia. Overnight, the people still hanging on no longer legally owned their homes. Then the post office erased the town's ZIP code in 2002. No ZIP code meant no town. Residents had to pick up their mail in nearby places, and some said they couldn't even get a pizza delivered. The legal fights dragged on. A handful of holdouts kept resisting, refusing to pack up and go. In 2009, eviction notices went out, but they still didn't budge. Finally, in 2013, the state made a deal. The last 7 people could stay for the rest of their lives, but once they were gone, the land would belong to Pennsylvania. It's wild enough that a modern American town was erased by a fire no one could put out. But what if I told you that some believed the whole thing had already been foretold back in the 1800s? By a furious priest. Believe it or not, but this whole thing had been predicted by a certain priest many years ago. This is where the story of Father Daniel Ignatius McDermott comes in. He was the first Catholic priest in Centralia back in the 1800s, and according to local legend, he didn't leave quietly. After a run-in with members of the Molly Maguires, a secretive Irish group tied to coal miners, he supposedly cursed the land in 1869. He declared that the town would be destroyed, leaving only St. Ignatius Roman Catholic Church standing. But there's something strange here. For many years, the church really did outlast almost everything else. Families moved out, buildings were demolished, but Mass was still held there until 1995. Only after that did it finally come down in 1997. So technically, the prophecy wasn't perfect, but it came uncomfortably close. Of course, the curse isn't the only story people in Centralia passed down. Another version floating around says witches were burned at the stake, on top of the coal seams, and when the ground collapsed, their ashes lit the mines below. Locals argue about it constantly. Some shrug it off, saying the fire started from trash burning at the landfill. Others insist that the timing, the stories, and the eerie aftermath are too perfect to dismiss. And it's not just the land that people talk about. Visitors often say they feel watched when they step into Centralia. Some claim to hear noises when there's no one around. It's easy to think the mind plays tricks, but I've noticed these reports are oddly consistent. People describe it in the same way, like the place has eyes. That energy, real or imagined, feeds into the idea that the whole town is haunted. Religious groups have taken it even further. In Christianity, fire shows up over 500 times in the Bible, and usually not in a friendly way. Fire destroys, cleanses, and punishes. Think of Sodom and Gomorrah reduced to ash, Think of Egypt being hit with fire during the plagues. Even Aaron's sons Nadab and Abihu, who were swallowed by flames after offering sacrifices the wrong way. Then in the New Testament, Jesus himself uses fire as a metaphor for eternal punishment. You can see how believers might look at Centralia and see something more than geology at work. Some theologians even treat the town as symbolic. They believe that the invisible blaze beneath the surface is like sin itself. You might not see it, but it's there, burning away, weakening the ground under your feet until everything collapses. People don't buy the curse or scripture explanations. They think it was a cover-up. Locals in a documentary even claimed the government never warned them about radioactive stuff in the coal. They say radon gas leaked into homes and pushed cancer rates up, and that Centralia became one of the country's worst cancer clusters. If that's true, the fire stops being just a natural disaster and starts to look like a way to hide toxic exposure. But once you bring the Cold War into it, things get even harder to make sense of. Pennsylvania was home to some very real and disturbing experiments at Holmesburg Prison. Inmates there were used as human test subjects for decades. Pharmaceutical companies, the military, and even the CIA got involved. They tested everything from dioxin, the chemical in Agent Orange, to radioactive isotopes. Some prisoners were dosed with drugs they didn't even know they were taking. Stories came out later of men hallucinating, losing control of their bodies, or suffering long-term health problems. The army and CIA were looking for anything that could be turned into a weapon. At the height of the paranoia, they wanted to build a Manchurian candidate, someone who could be controlled without knowing it. So they used LSD, mind-altering substances, and worse, all under the umbrella of secret programs like MKUltra. If that was happening openly in places like Philadelphia, is it really such a stretch to think Centralia could have been part of the same playbook? A toxic dump under the guise of a coal fire doesn't sound far-fetched when you line it up with what we already know they were doing. That's actually how the town got its nickname. People call Centralia the gateway to hell. And honestly, when you're standing on a cracked road with steam pouring out of the ground, it makes sense. Sinkholes pop up without warning. Carbon monoxide leaks from vents. Trees die in perfect circles where the ground burns hot. Even the asphalt splits apart, like something underground is trying to claw its way out. One visitor said it felt straight out of Dante's Inferno, like the earth itself was groaning. And it's not just Dante people compare it to. The Greeks believed the underworld could be reached through volcanic cracks in the earth, while the Romans thought Mount Etna was one of the doors to Hades. These days people compare it to the door to hell in Turkmenistan, that giant gas crater that's been burning for decades. Centralia, they say, is the American version. And the weirdness doesn't stop there. Paranormal groups come through all the time, drawn to the foggy streets and crumbling foundations. They claim they've recorded strange sounds, seen figures moving quicker than any person could, and felt that constant sense of being watched. When you think about it, it adds up. Centralia has more people buried in its cemeteries than living above ground. A town with more graves than homes, with smoke seeping out of the earth. No wonder people call it cursed. When the horror movie Silent Hill dropped in 2006, the screenwriter Roger Avery flat out said he based it on Centralia. And you can see it. The broken roads, the fog drifting through town, the dead patches of land. It all made it into the film. Maybe that's why thousands of people still show up every year. Paranormal groups, dark tourists, and anyone chasing that eerie ghost town vibe. For them, Centralia feels like walking onto a movie set, except it's all real. But movies aren't the only reason the town got its reputation. Rumours started spreading that the fire wasn't an accident at all. Some residents said it was never really about safety or moving people out. The real reason was money. Centralia sits on a massive reserve of anthracite coal, worth hundreds of millions, maybe even trillions. But the twist is that it was one of the only towns in Pennsylvania that actually owned its mineral rights. If the town disappeared as a legal municipality, those rights would bounce back to the state. Once everyone was out, the state would have full control of all that coal, which makes what happened next even harder to ignore. Early on, there were cheap proposals to put out the fire. One was estimated at $175. Another was supposedly offered for free, in exchange for some coal rights. Both were turned down. Instead, the state went with a more expensive solution, that conveniently didn't fix the problem. The company brought in was even told not to drill exploratory holes, which would have mapped the fire's true size. That restriction doesn't make much sense if the goal was to stop the fire. It does make sense if keeping the problem alive benefited someone else. Digging through the records makes the whole thing look even sketchier. An internal memo from the Office of Surface Mining admitted that county commissioners wanted to cut off federal funds to Centralia, not because of the fire itself, but for political reasons. Residents read that and felt vindicated. To them, it meant their displacement wasn't about safety, it was about clearing the board. And when the state moved in to demolish homes, rip out foundations, plant over old lots, and even take away the zip code, it started to feel like an erasure, as if Centralia was being scrubbed from the map on purpose. The distrust only deepened when officials started stonewalling. Residents asked for reports and state agencies refused to release them. One state representative accused the governor of burying a critical document about the dangers of the fire. He even wrote that the town was being used like a pawn in a cruel chess game. For families already living with carbon monoxide leaking into their basements, that wording hit home. The letters from agencies didn't help either. People would write in with serious concerns and get back the same boilerplate responses. No names and no details, just copy and paste reassurances. It's hard to trust that when sinkholes are opening under your neighbour's yard. And then there were the fights between government bodies themselves. A congressman once blasted the Office of Surface Mining for what he called recalcitrant behaviour, basically dragging its feet even after Congress had provided funds. Another representative even pushed for citing Interior Secretary James Watt for contempt, accusing him of cover-ups and negligence. If elected officials were saying it out loud, it's no wonder locals felt betrayed. The fight went on for decades. In 2010, some of the last residents took the government to court, accusing it of fraud. They never proved a grand conspiracy, but 3 years later, they walked away with a settlement. $349,500 each, and the right to live in their homes for the rest of their lives. After all that, you'd think Centralia was one of a kind. Turns out it's not. These are some of the places around the world that share that same mix of disaster, abandonment, and being stuck in time. The first one that always comes to mind is Pripyat. You've probably seen the photos before. A Ferris wheel standing tall but rusted out. Apartment buildings with trees growing right through the windows and toys still sitting in classrooms as if the kids just went out for recess and never came back. Pripyat was supposed to be a thriving Soviet city, built for workers of the Chernobyl power plant. Families moved there with dreams of steady jobs and a bright future. Then in April 1986, everything changed in a matter of hours. When the reactor exploded, it wasn't just the plant that was lost. The entire city had to be evacuated. Pripyat today is empty. The paint is peeling, the buildings are falling apart, but the story of the town is still alive. Tourists visit in protective gear, taking pictures like it's a movie set. For the people who once lived there, it's a wound that never healed. In that way, Pripyat and Centralia are alike. Both were lost not to war or nature, but to things humans created. One was fire underground, the other was radiation in the air. Both remind us that human ambition can turn back on us. And then there's Wittenoom in Western Australia. The town was built around an asbestos mine. For years, people worked there, raised families, built schools, and opened shops. But asbestos wasn't just another rock to dig up. It was dangerous. Tiny fibres filled the air, and once people breathed them in, they stayed in the lungs forever. The damage took years to show, but when it did, it was deadly. By the time the truth about asbestos was clear, it was too late. Workers and families had already been exposed, and cancer and lung disease were spreading. The government tried to deal with it, but finally chose to wipe the town away. They cut off services, closed the schools, tore down the buildings, and even removed the name from official maps. Still, like Centralia, a few people refused to leave. They stayed in the dust, calling it home, even when the world saw it as poisoned ground. What makes Wittenoom stand out is how extreme the government response was. They wanted the place gone so badly that they removed road signs leading to it. It's like they didn't just want the town empty, they wanted it forgotten. But history doesn't work like that. You can bulldoze houses, but you can't bulldoze memory. For the families who lost loved ones to asbestos, Wittenoom is as alive as it ever was. When you line these places up next to Centralia, The pattern starts to show. A small town built on hope and work. A hidden danger ignored for too long. Then, one day, the danger becomes impossible to hide, and suddenly the town doesn't belong to the people anymore. It belongs to the disaster. It's easy to think of it as a curse, but that's not how everyone sees it. The critics have their own angle, and it changes the story completely. With the smoke, the sinkholes, and the empty highway, it's no surprise people talk about Centralia like it's cursed, but plenty of others roll their eyes at that. They say it's nothing more than hard science, and that the numbers prove it. According to these researchers, coal seam fires aren't rare at all. They show up wherever coal mining has taken place. What makes Centralia unusual isn't that a fire started, but how long it has lasted and how large it has grown. And the reason it keeps burning, they argue, has nothing to do with curses or buried secrets. It's simple chemistry and geology. Anthracite coal, which Centralia sits on, is the hardest and purest type of coal. With so much carbon packed inside, it burns hotter, cleaner, and longer than other forms. To these scientists, this is the only explanation needed for why the ground is still smouldering after more than 60 years. The way they tell it, the fire's origin story is also much less mysterious than locals sometimes make it out to be. The accepted version traces back to Memorial Day weekend in 1962, when the town's volunteer firefighters lit a trash pile near the cemetery. It was supposed to be routine, the kind of cleanup they had done before. This time, though, the fire slipped through an open gap and hit an exposed coal seam. That one mistake, at least according to the official story, is what started the underground blaze that's still burning today. Not everyone agrees on how the fire really started. Some folks swear it was hot ash dumped into the pit that set it off. Others say an old mine fire from the 1930s never actually went out. And then there's the theory that the coal just lit itself, thanks to a mix of heat and the right chemistry. Sounds wild, but it can happen. Pyrite inside coal can break down and build enough heat to spark flames. It's been seen in storage piles and even on long shipments. Still, most scientists think the Memorial Day trash fire fits the timeline a little too perfectly to ignore. People always ask, why don't they just put the fire out? Sounds simple, right? But once a coal fire gets going underground, it's almost impossible to stop. Centralia's fire isn't some campfire you can dump a bucket of water on. It's burning nearly 300 feet down, stretching for miles, and the old mine tunnels basically work like giant air vents, feeding it oxygen non-stop. And here's the crazy part. You only need like 1 or 2% oxygen to keep a coal fire alive. That's nothing, but it's enough to keep Centralia burning all these years. On top of that, there's the problem of fuel. Centralia's anthracite seams are massive, and they act almost like a bottomless woodpile. Estimates suggest the fire could keep going for another 100 to 250 years. The ground itself makes things worse by acting like an insulator. The heat has nowhere to go, so the fire just sits there, steady and stubborn. Attempts to fight it have been too expensive. Trenching projects failed when the fire outran the diggers. Flooding the mines didn't work because water leaked away, or never fully reached the upper layers. Modern fixes like inert gases, foams, and chemicals don't last long, once the stored heat in the surrounding rock reignites everything. One estimate from the early 1980s put the cost of a full excavation at over $600 million. Not surprisingly, that option was abandoned. Even government records show that less than half of mine fire projects ever work, and the rate drops even lower if you remove excavations from the list. People who side with the science point out that the wilder theories, like government land grabs or even witch burnings, don't really hold up once you look at the numbers. Since the 1960s, state and federal agencies have drilled thousands of test holes around Centralia. They've measured heat, gases, and mapped how the fire spreads. What they found is that it isn't one giant wall of flames underground. It's more like broken pockets of fire, creeping in different directions. And the temperature data speaks for itself. Back in 1979, the town's mayor checked his underground gas tanks and found they were heating up. From 122 degrees to over 170. Inside the fire zone, it can hit over 1,000 degrees, sometimes close to 1,300. That's hotter than the surface of Mercury. Even above ground, the heat can warp pavement and melt the bottoms of your shoes. The gases are just as telling. Monitors have picked up carbon monoxide at levels 20 times higher than what a person could survive. Alongside it, scientists have found methane, carbon dioxide, benzene, and a cocktail of other compounds. At one point, a mercury study ran for an entire year, measuring tiny amounts of vapor carried out of the fire. Most of it wasn't enough to be dangerous, but it was still proof that the ground was breathing chemicals into the air. According to the non-believers, these details make any supernatural explanation unnecessary. The science explains everything, from the strange vents steaming in the winter to the sudden collapses that swallow up sections of land. They often bring up the story of the 12-year-old Todd Domboski, who nearly died in 1979 after falling into a sinkhole. It wasn't a curse or a punishment from above. It was plain and simple, caused by the ground collapsing as coal burned away beneath it. The so-called curses and hellish legends are also said to be nothing more than folklore layered onto a very real disaster. Take the old tale about Father Daniel Ignatius McDermott, back in 1869. According to local legend, after being attacked by the Molly Maguires, he cursed the town and said that St. Ignatius Church would be the last building left standing. It makes for a dramatic prophecy, but history simply doesn't back it up. That church didn't survive as the final landmark. It was torn down in 1997, leaving the curse with no leg to stand on. Journalist David Deacock, who's been covering Centralia for decades, doesn't have much patience for the curse stories. He says they just distract from what really happened. According to him, when you actually look at the town records, the engineering reports, and what locals saw, there's no prophecy at play. He argues it's only a mix of human mistakes, slow government action, and a coal fire that simply refuses to die. Hearing the naysayers lay things out like this, it's hard not to see their point. Every detail they bring up is backed by gas monitors, boreholes, and maps that track the fire's slow crawl. To them, Centralia isn't some mystery. It's a stubborn reminder of what happens when people tamper with the earth. Yeah, maybe the experts are right. But standing there is a whole different story. The road's cracked under your feet, smoke sneaking out of the ground, and it's quiet in a way that feels wrong, like the town itself is holding its breath. Numbers can tell you what's happening, but they'll never tell you what it feels like to be there. If you enjoyed this video about the burning town, get a bowl of popcorn and click this video on your screen now, you'll enjoy it more.